Hey everyone, Nathan here, Absurd Being. Alright, so what are we? Part 2, the fundamental phenomenological outlook, and Chapter 3, the region of pure consciousness. And in this video we're just going to dive into that region of pure consciousness, which is exactly where Husserl wants to go. That's kind of the sphere that Phenomenology opens up for us. It's the new realm which Husserl wants to carry his investigations into. It's the new realm he wants to make a science out of. There's a science in there, he thinks, that no one has appropriately tapped yet, and that's kind of the direction we're going to move into fully in this video. So the first section, transcendent experience versus the real world. So if we start from our natural human experiences, that is to say that natural standpoint, then these cause us to imagine a real world or a physical truth out there over and above our own conscious experience. So that the natural standpoint leads us to believe that there is something out there external to me whenever I'm having a perceptual experience that I'm actually perceiving, that is a referent for my perceptions. However, Husserl says we can imagine that the physical world the natural standpoint leads us to imagine might have been quite different. It's purely contingent. The laws of physics could all be different. The things that we see in that world that we are experiencing, they could all be completely different. There's nothing guaranteeing that any of them appear the way that they do. There's nothing necessary about that. In fact, he says it could even not exist at all. We can even go that far and presume or suppose that maybe that real world didn't even exist, need not even have existed at all. And if we subject our experience to an eidetic analysis, so looking at essential necessities and possibilities, then this is what we get. I'll give you a quote and then we'll have a look at it. The real world, as it is called, the correlate of our factual experience, then presents itself as a special case of various possible worlds and non-worlds, which on their side are no other than correlates of the essentially possible variations of the idea empirical consciousness, with its more or less orderly empirical connections. We must therefore not let ourselves be deceived by any talk about the transcendence of the thing over against consciousness or about its being in itself. All right, so a couple of things to note from that. The very first line in that quote, the real world is the correlate of our factual experience. So that's, the real world is the correlate of our experience. And remember that things are always things of experience. And all experiences are conscious experiences. So even though we're talking about a correlate of our experience, we aren't leaving the realm of consciousness at all here. There's nothing in this experience which, by rights, leads us to posit anything outside that experience. So the real world is a correlate of our factual experience. And that means that we're not going outside. If we take just what we have, the actual givens of our experience, there's nothing that leads us outside that. So that means that the real world is just one variation on the idea of empirical consciousness. So no empirical world as such, but a consciousness, a conscious experience that is empirical. That's kind of the idea here. The real world presents itself not as an actual existing thing outside, over and above my consciousness, but as a special case of various possible worlds and non-worlds that correlate to the idea empirical consciousness, that correlate to a consciousness that is empirical, not an actually existent external physical world. That's a leap that Husserl says we have no right to take. If we just look at our experience, what our experience tells us, if we break that down eidetically, this is what we get. Therefore, then, there is no thing, no being in itself, over and above, or, as he says in this quote, transcendent to consciousness. Every object that has being in itself is always in relation to consciousness and to ego. Everything is thing of the world about me, he says. Everything is it's right, I think, to say everything is centered on me. The world as I perceive it, as I experience it, always has me as a referent. I'm the central referent in this world. The world, everything in the world refers to me. And that's because it is just, it's all, the empirical world is not an independently existing thing. It is an empirical consciousness, a consciousness that is empirical. So he goes on to say, if we continue this inspection, this eidetic analysis of experience, that experience is always motivated, never an empty logical possibility. So this is a really interesting idea. And experience is motivated. What he means by that is that we aren't disengaged, impartial spectators. We aren't kind of standing over and above this objective reality which we're surveying from a distance. We are engaged. That's what he means when he says experience is motivated. It always centers on me, centers on my projects, centers on my desires, my willing, all of this. What the world is that was what I meant when I said it refers to me. So my experience is always motivated. I'm always engaged. I'm always vested in my experience of the world because it is mine, and there is no kind of objective, impartial viewpoint of the world. And this is an underdeveloped theme, actually, in ideas, I think. Heidegger obviously picks up on this and goes further with it, but especially, and also Merleau-Ponty does. He even uses the word motivated, I remember. I'm pretty sure I remember him using that word in Phenomenology of Perception. But to capture that same idea, we are... actually, he uses it, if I'm remembering the right place, he uses it to talk about we aren't... The world is not cause and effect. We don't perceive sensory causes, and the effect is kind of the perception that we have. Rather, we grasp the world through these motivations. I'm not explaining this very well. The sensory input is, rather than a cause, they're a motive to see the world in certain ways, to grasp it in certain ways. So rather than this idea of kind of cause-effect, determinism, it's not that strong. Rather, there's these sensory inputs appear as motives for us. They motivate us to think in certain ways, to take up the world in whatever way it is that we do. So anyway, that's cool. Experience is motivated. And he goes on further to say that all experience refers to the undetermined but determinable marginal field. And so that marginal field is that kind of it's not the I think I called it the immediate background in those three levels from way back from my third video. We talked about the three concentric spheres of experience. This is still in that first one, the marginal field. So it's what the object that we're focusing on, that we're thematizing. It's what that stands out against, the immediate background. That's the marginal field. So all experience has a marginal field which is undetermined. That's what makes it a background. That's what makes it a marginal field. But it's determinable. We can direct our attention to it at any time. But he also says the marginal field depends on my thing experiences. So these two, the thing and the marginal field, there's an interrelationship there, which again is not explored by Heidegger, by Husserl. It's not explored by Husserl, but it seems like there is kind of a natural reciprocity there between the two. And like I say, Husserl doesn't carry that any further, but that's a very interesting idea. So I've got a quote for this. All actual experience refers beyond itself to possible experiences, which themselves again point to new possible experiences, and so on infinitum. Every hypothetical construction of practical life and of empirical science is related to the shifting but ever-present horizon through which the world thesis receives its essential meaning. So there are real overtures here to the life world, which Husserl will talk about more in Crisis. That's still like 20 years away from ideas. But also Heidegger's being in the world, clearly. This is a much more kind of engaged Husserl, engaged in the real world here. That is what we're talking about, the real world, right? The correlate of our experience, our empirical consciousness. But remember that this is Husserl, not Heidegger. So all of this is eidetic insight regarding transcendent being. That's that Erfahrung experience. And that's why these, what I think are really interesting themes, these horizons, a milieu in which things take place, in which our experience happens. Experience is always motivated. This is where we're engaged in the world. These things are really neglected, actually, in ideas in particular, by Husserl. And that's because he's interested in not in this structure so much. He's interested in the way these experiences arise. He's interested in how these experiences occur, what it is that leads to them. Because for him, these are just conscious experiences. There is what's underpinning them is what he wants to get to with his phenomenology. He wants to understand the structure by which the experiences arise rather than the experiences themselves. And that's because he has that gap, he has that break, he's not investigating being in the world. That's not even a thing yet. That's going to become something with Heidegger. And it's that kind of gap, I think, that Husserl left into which existentialism stepped and really kind of took over with its existentialist brand of phenomenology, if you like, its existentialist leaning of phenomenology. So there's a short section as well about the absurdity of a real something outside this world. And I debated whether to even mention it, but it seems important. And so I thought I would. It's a little bit tough to figure out exactly what he's getting at as well. But the absurdity of a real something outside this world. And what I think he's talking about here is when he says outside this world, what he means is outside this ever-present horizon that we just talked about. This outside our experience of the world, outside our transcendent experience. So even though he's saying a real something outside the world that he's talking about here is the world that we have constituted, that exists as a correlate of our consciousness in our consciousness. And if you think about it in that way, things kind of click into place. So it's logically possible to imagine such a thing, an actually existing physical independent world outside my conscious experience of it. There's nothing illogical about it. It's logically possible, but it's absurd. And if you think about it, it kind of follows from everything that Husserl is talking about. The essential condition for something transcendent to exist is that it be experienceable, that we be able to experience. How could you have a transcendent experience that isn't experienceable? How could there be something beyond our experience which we can't experience, which we're prevented from experiencing, but that is itself a transcendent experience? And so this might sound a little bit tautological, like he's just kind of defined it in such a way that it comes out as being absurd. But remember that Husserl isn't making an argument here. This isn't like the conclusion of a set of premises. All he's saying is, if you look at your perception of the world, you'll see that it is a transcendent experience. You don't perceive a real something over and above your experience, on top of your experience. Your experience is all that there is. It makes no sense to say that in addition to that experience, there's something else over and above it existing separately, independently, and we never have access to that thing because it is transcendent to our experience. That just doesn't make sense. But Berkeley says actually exactly the same thing. But where he goes with it is he denies the existence of matter, denies that matter is real. But for Husserl, we're not going that far, right? Remember, we don't deny the physical world. That would be sophistry. We just suspend it. We just take no account of it in our philosophy. And this is why this is why Husserl brings up these motivations and horizons, not because he's interested in them per se. They are a part of the natural outlook. Rather, they make it clear that the world is always for the perceiver. The world is always what it is in relation to consciousness and an ego. And that's the point. That's the point that Husserl's getting at. The world, the empirical world as we understand it, as we experience it, has no independent existence over and above our experience of it. And so it makes it possible for us to doubt, to attempt to doubt its existence. And that's where we're going to go in the next section, immanent and transcendent being. All right, so we've already noted that the real world, the supposed real world, the physical world, is actually the correlate of our experience, but this doesn't permit us to go outside our experience of it. But we can go one step further. Let us think of the possibility of non-being which belongs to every thing-like transcendence. It is then evident that the being of consciousness of every stream of experience generally, though it would indeed be inevitably modified by a nullifying of the thing world, would not be affected thereby in its own proper existence. Thus, no real thing, none that consciously presents and manifests itself through appearances, is necessary for the being of consciousness itself. All right, so there's a lot in that quote. So first of all, we're talking about the possibility of non-being, which belongs to everything like transcendence. The possibility of non-being, though, remember, is not the elimination of the physical world. Husserl's not saying the physical world doesn't exist. Let's imagine that the physical world doesn't exist. Remember, this is eidetics, not empiricism. So talk of eliminating the physical world, it doesn't really make sense in phenomenology. And that's because to talk of eliminating the physical world is already to have presupposed that it exists, or that it existed, and now we're trying to get rid of it in some way. Just taking our experience, just subjecting our experience to that eidetic analysis, which we did in the last section, that's all we need to do. And that means that from there, now we can imagine the possibility of the non-being, not of the physical world, but of everything like transcendence. So still within the realm of consciousness, if you like, still not imagining that the physical world doesn't exist. We're imagining that everything like transcendence, everything like transcendent experience, that every Erfahrung experience is gone. So not the elimination of the physical world, but the elimination of this transcendent experience, this Erfahrung experience. But it is a bit of a fine line here, and there, you really do have to think about this quite a lot for everything to kind of slot into place. Well, I do anyway. I spent like half the week just kind of immersing myself in this chapter just for it all to sink in. But the key to remember, I think, is that Husserl's not into doubting the world like a skeptic or denying the world like a sophist. Rather, the world is always there in the background. It's the background on which we are philosophizing. That's going to feature much more in the later crisis that he writes in the 30s. But so that's not really the focus here. But the point is that it's not about getting rid of the physical world so much as getting rid of that transcendent experience, that Erfahrung experience that we talked about in the last video, the distinction between the transcendent and the immanent. So if we get rid of that, if we imagine that the possibility of non-being that attaches to every transcendent experience, then what we're doing is attempting to doubt transcendent being. That is, anything that appears through those perspectives, anything that we don't grasp all at once, anything that we have to grasp in pieces and anything therefore that we never have a full grasp over, as opposed to the immanent, which we do have a full grasp over. But again, the point of this is not to doubt or deny the existence of these thing-like transcendence, the thing-like transcendence. Their point is not to doubt even that. When we imagine their non-being, Husserl's not trying to doubt transcendent experience so much as he's trying to show something. He's trying to bring something forward. So when he says, if we think the possibility of non-being which belongs to everything like transcendence, it is then evident that, and so we get an explanation. So he's not engaged in doubting or denying either the physical world or the transcendent experience, the thing that appears in those perspectives. What he's trying to do is show us a couple of things. The first is how different transcendence and immanence are. The second is how certain and absolute immanence is in relation to transcendence. So even with the non-being of all transcendent being, of all the things that we experience through transcendent being, what's left is still something. We're still left with this immanent being, this realm of what he will call pure consciousness. That's still left over. That's a residuum that's left over even after we discount the whole of our empirical experience. And he goes on to talk more about this particular idea, this difference between immanent and transcendent being. When he says immanent and transcendent being are not friendly neighbors who occasionally enter into relation with each other. Not only are they totally different, but while immanent being is not dependent on transcendent being is totally dependent on immanent being. Consciousness, considered in its purity, must be reckoned as a self-contained system of being, as a system of absolute being, which has no spatio-temporal exterior and can be inside no spatio-temporal system, which cannot experience causality from anything nor exert causality upon anything, it being presupposed that causality bears the normal sense of natural causality as a relation of dependence between realities. On the other side, the whole spatio-temporal world is, according to its own meaning, mere intentional being. A being, therefore, which has the merely secondary relative sense of a being for a consciousness. It is a being which consciousness in its own experiences posits, but over and beyond this is just nothing at all. So in that the first half of that really long quote, all traces of that life world, that reference to the, Heidegger's kind of being in the world, that talk of motivation and the horizons, that's all gone. Now we're talking about pure consciousness, drilling down to that immanent being. It's not spatial, it's not temporal, it's not causal. It's completely transcendent from all of these things. It's completely, maybe it's a bit tricky to use that word. It's completely separate from all of these things. It's this kind of rarefied realm, absolute being. But then in the second half, the other side, the whole spatio-temporal world, transcendent being, this is secondary. It's without immanent being, without pure consciousness, it's nothing. Not only does it lack independence, it has no absolute essence whatsoever. It has the essentiality of something which in principle is only intentional, only known. Beyond this beyond what it is for that pure, absolute, immanent consciousness, it's nothing. And that really is what this whole chapter, or at least the first half of the chapter, is about. Getting to the, rather than, it might seem like he's trying to deny or doubt the existence of the real world or the physical world. He talks about that a lot, but the goal is to show that the real world, as we imagine it to be in the natural standpoint, is actually nothing more than a correlate of our experience, our Erfahrung experience, and that in turn is dependent on something else, this deeper, immanent, absolute experience, which is this, not absolute experience, but the deeper absolute being, which is pure consciousness, this realm of pure consciousness. So not only are immanent and transcendent being separate, but transcendent being is completely dependent on immanent being. And that is then what drives everything. That's the ground for Husserl that he's moving back towards, that he wants to grasp. Now we've kind of entered that region, and this is what it looks like, pure consciousness. And that coincidentally is the title of the next section, Pure Consciousness. So that once we've come to all of this, once we've gone through all of the thinking that's involved so far, in this chapter we come to this recognition that this is why Husserl wants to make the phenomenological reduction, which is the same thing as we talked about earlier, a couple of videos back, the phenomenological epoche. I still think Husserl is kind of bouncing all over the place with these terms. He doesn't seem very rigorous. We're going to look at the reductions in the next video, and I don't believe it gets any clearer. I don't think there's any real, terms still just kind of get thrown around without real consistency, I think. But when he talks about the phenomenological reduction, we're talking about that epoche. It's why he wants to do it, because it lets us drill down into this realm of pure consciousness, bracketing out all of our theories, our physical theories, bracketing out our belief in the external world, bracketing out all of the scientific knowledge that we've acquired, which concerns this external world which exists independent of us. Setting aside all of that lets us uncover or see through to what it is that grounds all of this stuff in the first place. And that's what we're doing with the phenomenological reduction, setting aside our naive knowledge, which we've taken from the natural perspective, turning to pure consciousness in its own absolute being, which remains over. That's that phenomenological residuum after we suspend the natural world, because this absolute being, properly understood, conceals in itself all transcendences, constituting them within itself. And that's what I've just been saying. The world, the immanent being is where is what transcendent being is grounded on. It's what causes transcendent being to come about. In the natural attitude, our reflections then are directed to the world of experience. But in the phenomenological attitude, our reflections are directed back to experience itself. That is, to absolute being. And this is what Husserl calls the basic field of phenomenology. And that's really the bulk of this chapter. He adds a little bit here about the universality of phenomenology, All natural sciences concern themselves only with a portion of reality, a portion of nature. They kind of focus on one part. Eidetic science, however, as the study of absolute being, concerns the whole and is the only science that can concern itself with the whole, because it is the ground of that nature that every other science picks and chooses from within, that every other science, from which every other science takes a portion for it to study. And then there's it turns out to be almost half the chapter, a section he calls supplementary remarks. And I thought before I even read it, I was thinking maybe, okay, we'll get half a page out of this, maybe that'll be it. But I got like so much more out of it than I expected. So it's worth an entire section devoted to itself. So that's the last part of the video today, supplementary remarks. So in this section, we start by really just carrying on with what we talked about in the last part, in the first half of the chapter. Husserl talks about how he's against this notion of postulating an unknown, unknowable cause of perception separate from the perceptions themselves. Any cause of perceptions, he says, must itself be perceptible, must be experienceable. And we talked about this before with the logical possibility, but the absurdity of postulating something external, different, that's independent of the our experience, and that is not experienceable. It must, if it's a cause of our perceptions, it must itself be perceptible, if not by us, at least for other egos who see better and farther than we do. Otherwise, it becomes an empty psychological possibility. And I think I would call this a rampant metaphysical speculation. He's also against, in the same vein of thought, copy and sign theories. So we've talked about this before as well. An image points to something different from it, right? The image is not the thing itself, it's a representation. An image points to something different from it, but the physical thing is nothing foreign to that which appears in a sensory body, but something that manifests itself in it and in it alone in a primordial way. So when we see something, we have these sensory impressions of it. The sensory impressions are not something over and above the actual physical thing. So this is really that distinction between primary and secondary qualities that we talked about in the last video, I think. The copy and the reference back to copy and sign theories. The thing is what it is as the subject of sensory determinations, just as much as it is the subject of the physical. It is what it is as the subject of, as we perceive it according to those secondary qualities, just as much as it is what we perceive according to the primary qualities. And those primary qualities announce themselves in the sensory. There is no such thing as the primary and the sensory are a bundle. There is no primary quality without secondary qualities. We never see just extension without any kind of secondary qualities associated with it. They always come together. In short, the thing that appears to sense, which has the sensory properties of shape, colour, smell and taste, is therefore far from being a sign for something else. On the contrary, it is the thing that appears as such under those phenomenal conditions. And that's a really great insight that Merleau-Ponty really gets a lot of use out of. The thing, the sensory qualities by which we perceive a thing don't direct us to something else. They're not signs that point us towards a deeper, truer reality. They are just that thing, that reality itself, the way that it appears under those phenomenal conditions. I love that. I love that idea. And there's a summarizing quote I've extracted for this section of the supplementary remarks. It is pure mythology to set up what the reason so transparently puts into our hands as an unknown world of thing realities in themselves, a hypothetical substructure devised to subserve the causal explanation of appearances. Pure mythology, there you go, to invoke some kind of external, unexperienceable realm of things that are composed of these primary qualities. And he goes on to talk about realism, which he says confuses sensory appearances, i.e. appearing objects, mere subjectivity, which are, by the way, remember, already transcendent, confuses those sensory appearances with the absolute immanent appearances which constitute them. So what happens is the ground is taken to be not consciousness, not the absolute immanent experience that actually does ground them, but the object itself, but the appearing object. And that this then, so that's kind of the root of the problem of realism, conflates those two things, the appearing objects with the immanent absolute experience that constitutes them. The result is we think the objects are themselves the ground, not the consciousness. But what's interesting about this is it leads to erroneous thinking about causality. And Husserl's quite insightful here. He makes a couple of insightful remarks. Causality has no meaning outside the realm of the constituted intentional world. So that's not really anything, doesn't really go beyond what Kant has already told us. Causality doesn't have any meaning beyond our transcendent experiences that have already been constituted by this pure immanent consciousness. But he says two things about causality that I thought were interesting. The two consequences of thinking about causality in this as a result of our realist way of looking at the world. The first is that causality becomes understood as a mythical bond between objective being, those primary qualities, and subjective being, the secondary sense qualities. And the second thing that's interesting is that causality also becomes understood as a mythical bond, again, between physical being itself and absolute consciousness. And this is a bond which operates through those secondary qualities. So there are two ways that causality gets two ways that we think erroneously about causality if we follow realism. We get this notion that the objective being, which is describable in terms of primary qualities, causes the secondary qualities. So there's an element of causality there, but then there's another causality, another cause-effect relation or bond between the being itself, the thing itself, and consciousness, which sees them. So the thing itself, through those secondary qualities, causes certain things, certain effects in consciousness. And so we get those two incorrect ideas about causality if we follow realism. And he, as a final point here concerning realism, he notes that realism relies on models so much because models are symbolical representations of what is unintuitable to sense. So it fits in with the whole the modus operandi of realism, which is that there is this external realm which cannot be experienced, and we're just kind of getting an external view of it. We're making representations of what is fundamentally unexperienceable out there, and that's why it relies on models, because that's exactly what models do, right? It's exactly how they work. They're symbolic representations which indicate something else, which have to be interpreted and have to be explained, because they're not the thing themselves, right? A model is not the thing that it models. And that's exactly how realism sees the world. That's exactly the way realism sees our experience, understands our relation to the world. So that was interesting as well. Then he looks at the psychological point of view, and this is another interesting discussion. So we have consciousness is the absolute within which everything transcendent is constituted. Fine. But the question he asks here is, how can it also be then a subordinate real event within this world? How can we also come to know consciousness through or as something occurring within that world, if consciousness is constituting that world in the first place? How do we come to see consciousness as a part of that world? And this is what Husserl calls the this is what he refers to as the subject of psychology. This is what psychology studies, the consciousness as it appears in the world, as it appears. So not as the absolute consciousness that phenomenology takes it to be, but psychology studies consciousness once it's already kind of manifested in the world. But how can this be if consciousness is constituting that world in the first place? And his answer to this, I think I was left kind of dissatisfied with this, but he says it takes place through the body, through the empirical body. And I don't think he really nails this. I don't think he answers the question. I'll give you the quote, and then I'll come back to this problem. So he says, consciousness remains the immanent stream of experiences that it is. It doesn't become something corporeal. This would be absurd to Husserl. And yet it has become something other than it was, a very part of nature. In itself, it is what it is. Its essential nature is absolute, but it is not grasped in its absolute essence, in its flowing thisness, but as something apprehended. And in this quite distinctive form of apprehension, a quite distinctive transcendence shapes itself. A state of consciousness appears, which is the state of a self-identical, real ego subject. So basically the idea, there are 2 points of view we can take here. In the first, or in one, we've got the psychological point of view, where we glance in which we glance the apprehended object, the inner state of the human being, the self-identical real ego subject. That's consciousness as an apprehended object, as an object which is in the natural world. But from the other point of view, the phenomenological point of view, we see the absolute pure consciousness, which constitutes that former psychological view. So this is fine, I think. This idea, definitely, this made me think of Plato for sure. The way that you've got the forms in their transcendental realm, timeless, spaceless, and they kind of manifest, they appear in the world, but obviously that appearance is always less than what they really are in themselves. And it's kind of something similar here, except for Husserl, there's more of a reflective element here. So for Husserl, consciousness itself is the transcendent, rarefied kind of realm, and it's kind of turning its glance back on itself and seeing itself in a different light, seeing itself not as it really is, but as it is in the natural world, as it is in this world of space and time, and surrounded by other things, and all of the trappings that come with the natural viewpoint. And it does this, it's able to do this through the body. The body is what makes, the empirical body is what makes this process of self-reflection, which doesn't reflect on itself as it really is, but reflects on itself as a thing in the natural world, is what makes that possible. And that's where I kind of think he didn't explain this properly, didn't explain it well, because, okay, so consciousness is able to see itself as a part of the natural world. This is the psychological view, and it's able to do this through the body. But then the body surely is now a problem. How is it that consciousness is able to use the body in this way? The body must then exist separate from consciousness in some way. So now we're kind of, I feel like, there's still a gap in the explanation here. We now have to explain how it is that the body exists as unconstituted by consciousness, in order for it to function as this reflexive pathway for pure consciousness to see itself in the psychological view. So to answer this, I think you would need a metaphysical theory about how consciousness arises in the first place. And we're not going to get that in phenomenology. Phenomenology starts with consciousness. Consciousness is the absolute. That's where everything begins from. And so there's I think Husserl has no hope of answering this question. The body is a good place to start, though, in terms of phenomenology. But again, he doesn't go as far through with this as actually Sartre has a nice account of the way that the body features, the way that the body appears for us as in terms of our phenomenological experience, in terms of phenomenology. But yeah, this, I think, it's not answered, and it can't be, by Husserl, because it's just beyond. It's a different discipline. I think the answer is in metaphysics, not in phenomenology. And then we move on to kind of just dispensing with all of the subtleties that we went through in the first half about how we're not denying or eliminating the physical. Now he just comes out and says, imagine that the world of nature, the physical, disappears. No bodies, no people, no psychological experience, or no experience of a person. As a person, I would also disappear. But my consciousness, however its states of experience might vary, would remain an absolute stream of experience with its own distinctive essence. Certainly, an incorporeal and, paradoxical as it may sound, even an inanimate and non-personal consciousness is conceivable, i.e., a stream of experience in which the intentional empirical unities, body, soul, empirical ego, subject, do not take shape. So this one, now, far less keen on this idea, actually. So talking about, I mean, the way to take this is definitely as a supplementary remark, because we're kind of, as I said, riding roughshod over all of the subtleties that were in the first part of this chapter about, we're not eliminating the physical and how that's already been caught up in the natural standpoint and so on and so forth. And now we're just coming out and saying, okay, imagine everything disappears, everything physical. But the idea is what Husserl's trying to investigate here is this notion of what's left over. And so this idea of a non-personal, inanimate and non-personal consciousness, I'm not 100% keen on this. And I really feel like he's just stretched himself a bit too thin here. The impersonal, whenever I hear impersonal, I always think of Merleau-Ponty. He talks about this a lot in terms of some of the horizons that make up our experience. The habit body is something else which is to a certain degree impersonal. Things not related to me, but yet which influence me and are factors in my experiences. These all come through in Merleau-Ponty as impersonal, and that's a really legitimate way of thinking of it. But that's very different from the way that Husserl uses it here. And the idea of an impersonal consciousness starts to get a little bit Buddhisty for me, actually. Although I don't think Husserl is really going in that direction. I don't think we're getting to the realm of a universal consciousness. But still, it just doesn't make any sense to me, to be honest. To start talking about a non-personal consciousness, I can't even begin to imagine what that could mean. And I don't think it follows from anything we've talked about. You've got, we looked at the immanent and the transcendent, how they're different, check. How the transcendent depends on the immanent, check. But now we've got this, the immanent can exist actually without the transcendent, without any content. And that, I think, is problematic. And I don't think there's anything wrong with saying that the immanent depends on the transcendent as well, even though the transcendent is directly springs up from the immanent. That's fine. So the immanent is kind of prior in that sense. But I don't think we have to go so far as to say the immanent there's something left over, even if you get rid of all transcendence, all content. Right? I mean, if consciousness is intentional, if there is no content, what's left? How can there be contentless, intentional consciousness? What's it intending? Without experience, what is a stream of experience? If the stream is made up of experiences and you get rid of the experiences, what's left? It seems this seems a bit of a bridge too far for me. And yeah, like I say, it's there. It's a small section. Maybe Husserl was just really gung-ho on this idea of establishing immanent being, right? Pure consciousness as this absolute, completely independent grounding. But he then, in taking it that far, he kind of got pushed into saying that a non-personal consciousness is conceivable. And yeah, I don't know. I disagree. I just don't think it is. But like I say, it's just a small section. I can't remember if this comes up again. If it does, it'll be interesting, and anything else that he has to say in ideas. But yeah, it's there. So take it on board. And the last part of these supplementary remarks which I thought was interesting, was where he talks about unities of meaning. So all unities are unities of meaning. And this means that they flow from a sense-giving consciousness that is an absolute, immanent, pure consciousness. An absolute reality is just as valid as a round square. Reality and world, here used, are just the titles for certain valid unities of meaning, namely unities of meaning related to certain organizations of pure absolute consciousness. So the idea that an absolute reality, a foundational physical reality, is nonsense for Husserl. World/reality is meaning, not matter. When we talk about unities, when we talk about an object, we're talking about unity of meaning, not some kind of, not matter, not physical matter. The world is a unity, and that means it's a unity of meaning, which means it can only come from a sense-giving consciousness. It can't come from just brute matter, physical reality. So it's really a completely different way of understanding the words world and reality. A way of understanding. I mean, and that's underlined. It's underlined everything that I've said in this video. The world is the world as it is through transcendent being, through our transcendent experience, which is to say, an experience of pure consciousness. And so it's just being clear here, everything that is constructed through or constituted by this pure consciousness is meaning. It's a unity of meaning. And so when we talk about world, when we think about reality, that's what we're talking about. A unity of meaning, not some kind of external physical matter which is independent of, which makes any kind of sense independent of a sense-giving consciousness. And I think that's a really interesting point. And it means that the world doesn't make any sense without a consciousness. There's just no way in which you can talk about the words world or reality without a consciousness behind them to give them sense, to give those unities sense, because that's what the world is. It's a unity. That's what reality is. It's a unity. It's not, and if that's what it is fundamentally, then it can only come from something which can bestow unity, which can give meaning. Which can only bestow meaning, which can give meaning, and that's consciousness. So he says here, this is not idealism like Berkeley, because the world is not a subjective illusion. It's real and it's meaningful. It's just not foundational. So that's kind of a subtle difference, I mean, it's right. Husserl's, if we could say maybe Husserl's idealism isn't Berkeley's idealism, I think is the better way to put it. But Husserl insists that it's not idealism because idealism takes the world to be a subjective illusion. That's not what he's doing. The world is real, it's meaningful, it's a unity of meaning. It's just not foundational. So, yeah. Your definition of the word idealism will affect how you think about that. All right, that means it's time for a summary. So first we looked at transcendent experience versus the real world. And the idea the real world is the correlate of a conscious experience. So we're not denying the physical. We're not rejecting the physical. We're not postulating it in the first place. That's the idea. We're not going, the postulate that there is an external world is something that we are assuming from the beginning. That's what empiricism assumes. We're just not making that assumption. The real world, if we analyze our experience, is connected. It's tethered to a conscious experience. It's tethered to a consciousness. And at the very end of the video, we talked about world or reality as a unity of meaning. And this means that our experience of the world is always motivated. The world always refers to the consciousness that is constituting it. And it always appears in a horizon, an undetermined marginal field. These are two of the ways that world manifests for us as a consequence of it being a unity of meaning, as a consequence of it arising from a sense-giving consciousness. Then we looked at immanent and transcendent being. The main ideas here, these two are totally different. And transcendent being is dependent on immanent being. Transcendent being is contingent. Immanent being is absolute. And immanent being brings us to the realm of pure consciousness, that Husserl also calls this a stream of experience. And there was an interesting point that Husserl made regarding this pure consciousness, that it could be impersonal. So it's coherent, he claims, to talk of a stream of experience which lacks empirical unities. And finally, the other thing to take away from this video, I think, is the psychological point of view that we looked at, where pure consciousness grasps itself not as it truly is, but as itself as an empirical object. And this was supposed to take place through the body, but I suggested that there is something missing in this explanation, but still the notion of psychology, how psychology comes about and what its subject matter is, I think is very legitimate. Psychology deals with pure consciousness, but not as it truly is, pure consciousness as it's seen from or through the natural viewpoint. Okay, that is that chapter. My notes for these chapters are just getting longer and longer. I'm really I don't want to go over one video per chapter if I can help it, but I know I am going to have to do that later in a couple of chapters. But yeah, for 20 pages in the book, I don't want to have to do more than one video. That's going to drag this series out much longer than I'd like. So anyway, hopefully that helped. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video where we look at these reductions.